It is 3 a.m. in New York, 8 in Berlin, and 4 on a Thursday afternoon here in Seoul. I'm Moon Gun-young. This is Arirang, Korea's only global network. We begin this Thursday afternoon in Berlin, where President Park Geun-hye is kicking off the second day of her state visit to Germany. Now, the day before, the Korean president, who's been campaigning for the reunification of the two Koreas there, secured the full support of Berlin based on Germany's own unification experience. While the Korean president called the reunification of the two Koreas a bonanza, the German chancellor said her country's experience was Glücksfall, the German equivalent. Our presidential office correspondent Cheol-soo reports from Berlin.
At a joint press conference, Chancellor Merkel said Germany, which has gone through unification itself, is responsible for supporting the two Koreas' will to reunite. And President Park and the German Chancellor agreed to set up a cooperative system to prepare the Korean peninsula for social and economic unity.
독일이 갖고 있는 통일에 대한 어떤 경험, 또 지식 이런 것을 참고로 해서 우리 한반도에서도 평화 통일을 이루기 위해서 어떤 준비를 해야 할까 하는 것을 여러 가지로 구체화해 나가고자 합니다.
When asked about President Park's recent description of reunification on the Korean peninsula as a bonanza, Merkel said Germany's unification was indeed a bonanza. Coming from the communist East herself, Merkel said she witnessed the lives of more than 17 million East Germans change for the better after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
A lot of economic support will be necessary in connection with a reunification. The second thing is that people should be prepared to get to know very different biographies.
President Park also garnered Merkel's support behind her trust-building policies towards North Korea, at the same time urging Pyongyang to give up its nuclear weapons. On the economic front, the two leaders agreed to expand cooperation between the two sides' small and mid-sized firms in vocational training and science and technology. Earlier in the day, President Park visited the Brandenburg Gate, a landmark in Berlin, symbolic of German unification. Behind me is the Brandenburg Gate, which President Park visited earlier on this Wednesday. She'll continue with her reunification campaign here in Germany this week by meeting with former officials who are at the center of German unification and by laying out her reunification policies during a speech in Dresden. Cheol-soo, Arirang News, Berlin.
North Korea has blasted President Park for emphasizing the importance of denuclearizing North Korea at the Nuclear Security Summit in The Hague that wrapped up earlier this week. A spokesperson from the regime's committee that deals with unification said Thursday that President Park's remarks were, quote, thoughtless and ignorant, and that she should watch what she says if she really wants to improve inter-Korean relations. The harshly worded comments mentioning President Park directly by name are the first since Pyongyang had agreed to stop cross-border slandering. The South Korean government says it regrets the disrespectful remarks. It also said Pyongyang should understand that President Park was not trying to slander North Korea. Meanwhile, the United States has called an urgent UN Security Council meeting to seek ways to punish North Korea for its latest ballistic missile firings. U.S. Congress will also consider North Korea's sanctions legislation in May. Our Hwang Ji-hye has the details.
The UN Security Council will hold discussions Thursday on ways to punish North Korea for its latest ballistic missile launches. The request for a special meeting came from the United States after Pyongyang test-fired two medium-range Nodong ballistic missiles into the EC. On Wednesday, Deputy U.S. State Department spokeswoman Marie Harf said Washington is already in talks with other members of the UN Security Council and its allies and partners to take appropriate measures against the North for its latest provocation.
But those are choices the North Korean government has to make. And we've been clear that the sanctions, the diplomatic isolation, the economic isolation, the political isolation, that will all continue as long as they don't.
She went on to emphasize the U.S. takes Pyongyang's latest military posturing seriously since it clearly violates UN Security Council resolutions banning the nation from any ballistic missile launches. In a related move, U.S. Congress will also consider North Korea sanctions legislation in May. Representative Ed Royce, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, unveiled the schedule as he addressed a congressional hearing on North Korea's human rights abuses. Roy said his committee will do all it can to hold the North Korean leader and his aides responsible for crimes against humanity. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
Now, North and South Koreans will work together in an attempt to resolve the so-called comfort women issue. Civic groups from the two Koreas will meet soon to discuss ways to counter Japan's denial of its wartime crimes. Arirang News Foreign Affairs correspondent Hwang Sang-hee has the details.
In a rare show of cooperation, civic groups from the two Koreas will seek ways to demand Japan issue an official apology for its wartime sexual enslavement of women in the early 20th century. The Seoul-based Korean Council for the Women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan said Thursday that it will meet with a North Korean civic group at the end of this month in the Chinese city of Shenyang. Around 200,000 women, mostly Korean, were forced to serve the Japanese military during the Second World War, and many are still waiting for a heartfelt apology from Japan. The planned conference will be the first time in 8 years for the Koreas to put their heads together on the matter. An official at Seoul's Unification Ministry said the South Korean civic group proposed to counter Japan's ongoing denial of its wartime crimes together, and that the North agreed. 24 South Koreans, including one survivor of Japan's military sexual slavery, will meet 10 North Korean representatives. Meanwhile, a diplomatic source said Wednesday that a Japanese government official met with a human rights activist taking care of the Korean victims for the first time last week in Seoul. The Japanese government initially asked to meet with the comfort women to determine their demands ahead of a government-level meeting between Seoul and Tokyo next month. The Japanese official reportedly said Tokyo wants to resolve the diplomatic feud, stressing Prime Minister Shinzo Abe showed his sincerity about the matter by stating his willingness to uphold Japan's landmark 1993 apology to the comfort women. In response, the South Korean activist urged Japan to acknowledge Tokyo's legal responsibility for forcing the victims into sexual slavery. The activist also said the Japanese leader should apologize to the victims on the international stage. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
Now, another thoughtless remark has been uttered by a Japanese politician that's sure to anger Korea. On Wednesday, co-leader of the opposition Japan Restoration Party, Shintaro Ishihara, said his country's colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula in the early to mid-1900s was necessary to defend itself against the Soviet Union's advance into Asia. Now, Ishihara, known for his hawkish views, went on to say that the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Tokyo is more important to Korea than to Japan. He also expressed doubts about the benefits of the improving relationship between Korea and China. Ishihara's remarks follow the first official meeting of the current leaders from Korea and Japan earlier this week in The Hague. Now, moving on to domestic politics, following its official launch on Wednesday, Korea's newest political party hit the ground running this Thursday morning. In its first Supreme Council meeting, the New Politics Alliance for Democracy put utmost priority on those who have fallen through the cracks of the welfare system. Arirang News political correspondent Ji Myung-kil has more.
화이팅! 화이팅! 지방 선거 승리와 후원 교체 화이팅!
The New Politics Alliance for Democracy Party set sail this Thursday with the opening of its first Supreme Council meeting. The new opposition party's co-leaders Kim Han-gil and Cheol-soo said their focus is on the people.
Our new alliance top priority will be enhancing the people's livelihoods. Our first lawmaking activities will be devoted to revising 3 existing welfare bills.
The proposed amendments to the 3 bills focus on reaching those most in need of financial help. If the revisions are passed, local governments will be able to assist people who are in need of urgent financial aid, with a particular emphasis on families who are having a hard time paying their water, electricity, and medical bills.
If our first revised welfare bill gets passed, some 1 million desperate families who are in need of financial help will receive it from the government.
The ruling Saenuri Party congratulated the newly unified opposition party, but with conditions attached.
We are keeping a close eye on the new party's pledge for strong national security and an innovative and growing economy. We'll have to wait and see how well those pledges are carried out.
Despite the new party's liberal base, it has vowed to adopt what they call conservative values. As for the June 4th local elections, Kim Han-an said that the New Politics Alliance for Democracy will not engage in a nomination process, saying it acts as a breeding ground for bribery and corruption. Ji Myung-kil, Arirang News.
The Korean government is wasting no time in its push to cut out the red tape it says is slowing down economic growth. The Deputy Prime Minister convened a meeting earlier this morning and picked out dozens of regulations that will either be amended or abolished completely in the coming months. Our Kim Ji-yeon reports.
The government is speeding up its deregulatory reforms. Finance Minister Cheol-soo presided over the first ministerial-level meeting on the matter Thursday to inspect, evaluate, and come up with follow-up measures to President Park Geun-hye's 3-year economic innovation plan. They started with the recommendations proposed during working-level talks held earlier this week and pinpointed 52 regulations that could be improved, including one that would ultimately allow for the operation of food trucks. Hyun said 41 of the regulations can be addressed immediately, with 27 of them to be amended in the first half of this year.
Regulations that could be amended by administrative or in-house measures should be completed and ready to take effect by April. Regulations that require legislative amendments, let's get them done by the end of June.
For the operation of food trucks, the government will allow trucks with a loading capacity of at least 0.5 square meters. The food trucks will be able to do business in amusement and theme parks in the latter half of this year. The ministry says it is working with the Transport Ministry to cut regulations on the tuning of automobiles as well, so long as it does not affect passenger safety. The aim there is to promote the use of vehicles for leisure purposes, such as camping cars and caravans, and boost the country's auto components industry. A task force will be launched to find ways to promote the country's service sector, particularly in the finance, education, medical, broadcasting, and tourism areas. The Korea Society for Regulatory Studies estimates that around 200,000 new jobs will be created through deregulation in the medical and education sectors alone. The ministry is also going to be gathering opinions and recommendations from the public on economic innovation through a portal site. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Now moving on, Korean cars accounted for nearly 9% of the auto market in China last year, which is the highest level ever. But they are aiming to expand their presence there even more, with Hyundai Motor announcing plans to build a 4th factory in China. Arirang News Song Ji-sun reports.
Korea's 2 largest automakers logged a record 8.8% market share in China last year. That consolidates the Hyundai Kia Automotive Group as the 3rd biggest auto brand in China. It's a significant feat considering the Korean auto group only entered the Chinese market around 10 years ago. Market leaders GM and Volkswagen have been in China for several decades. But the goal is to land a 10% share in the Chinese market, a figure that commonly guarantees stable growth in the auto industry. To that end, Hyundai Motor is building a new factory in China's Midwest. Hyundai Motor and Chongqing, the biggest city in the region, agreed Thursday to build their 4th local factory there. That means additional production of 300,000 cars a year, and with Kia Motors' 3 local factories, their combined production will now exceed 2.3 million cars a year. Even so, the aggressive move was necessary, as China's market leaders, Germany's Volkswagen Group and GM Motors of the US, will both have a production capability of around 4 million units by 2016. After recording over 20 million car sales last year, the Chinese auto market is expected to grow by 15% this year.
China is the biggest and fastest growing auto market in the world, with demand that is expected to reach 35 million cars by 2020. There's no other market of this size and momentum, making it the most attractive and important market for all global automakers.
Korean automakers must also rev up research and development on green energy cars so they abide by Beijing's regulations aimed at tackling the country's chronic pollution problem. 송지선, Arirang News.
The Worldwide Fund for Nature, or WWF, opens its very first Korean branch in Seoul this week. The environmental NGO held a press conference on Thursday to explain its goals, and they include mobilizing civil society and raising awareness about climate change and sustainable fisheries. WWF Korea also plans to promote the increased use of renewable energy in the country by closely cooperating with related ministries and companies. Established in 1961 in Switzerland, the Global Conservation Organization now has more than 100 branches worldwide. WWF Korea's CEO and co-chairman Jean-Paul Padak said the group's Earth Hour initiative has been especially successful in Korea in recent years.
Seoul has been very active in its environmental leadership. They have been a great supporter of Earth Hour in Korea, and in the past 3 years, Earth Hour has been the fastest growing market for this initiative that WWF started 8 years ago. Seoul has been selected as a finalist for the Earth Hour City Challenge competition, which is a global competition, and we congratulate Seoul for achieving that.
WWF's Earth Hour initiative is a grassroots movement to raise awareness about energy by calling on people to minimize consumption for 1 hour. Now, this year's Earth Hour falls at 8:30 p.m. Korea time on March 29th. Now, making headlines in this country over the past few days has been a scandal involving a multi-millionaire property developer. Korean prosecutors earlier this week overturned a controversial landmark ruling that allowed a convicted property mogul to pay off a multi-million-dollar fine with 49 days prison labor. Now, Seoul Supreme Court sparked outrage back in 2011 when it ruled that former Teju Group head Ho Jae-ho was given the jail work option of overpaying roughly $23 million in fines following a conviction for embezzlement and tax evasion. Well, for a closer look into what makes this case so controversial and the significance it carries, we are joined live in the studio by Dr. Kim Byoungjoo, the head of KLNP Consulting, and of course, our regular commentator on this program. Good afternoon, Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon.
Now, the former chairman of Teju Group, Ho Jae-ho, he was facing about 25 billion won, roughly $23 million of fines.
Right.
And to pay it off, he was given 49 days of prison labor as a janitor.
Right.
Now, why don't you break down these numbers for us so we can, understand better what the controversy is?
Right, indeed. A hugely controversial case that we are talking about here. And let's break down those numbers to explain what exactly is a problem. Let's bring up those numbers on the screen so that we can have better understanding about why Korean public is so angry about this case. 25.4 billion won is the fine that he faces at this point. And what the court decided was that he will work 49 days, inside the prison labor. Actually, until yesterday, he was working as a janitor. And this janitor work that he was producing every day was worth, according to the court decision, 500 million won per day. And that's the amount that some of the Korea's top CEO gets paid per year. So his janitor work per day was producing as much of value, according to the court at that time.
Very, very expensive person.
Yeah, indeed. And it's not fair, the public is saying, because ordinary citizens usually, their prison work is counted as worth about 50,000 won, as you can see on the screen. So that's like how many times? 10,000 times more valuable in his case in comparison with ordinary citizens' prison work. And the court had a choice to give him all the way up to the maximum 3-year time for prison work. If that had been applied, still everyday work as a prison laborer, his work would produce the amount of 23 million won worth value. That's about what Korea's college graduates get paid per year. Per year. So still that's very high. But even if that court, comparing that case, if court had applied the maximum length of time, still this current latest final ruling agreeing or offering him or acknowledging his value of labor as 500 million won is about 21 times higher than what the court could have done. That's why they're saying this is wrong, and this is where we are hearing the controversy about.
Well, unless he has, outstanding expertise in janitor work.
I would doubt that.
Now, how could the Korean judicial system come up with such an outrageous ruling?
It's basically finger pointing all over at this point. A lot of people are saying, they were saying the prosecutors in Gwangju district, they had funny things by even giving up the possibility of appeal for this ruling. But then again, the prosecutors in Gwangju, they're saying, well, we imposed him 100 billion won fine, but it is the court that gave him 25 billion won. So the court is responsible. But then again, court is saying that 100 billion won fine was not actually a real one because they wanted have this one expired. The responsibility for paying this fine expired after a certain period of time. So we are the one, they're saying, the judges are the ones who actually imposed the real penalty here. And even the central, the public prosecutor's office here in Seoul are saying that, well, these guys in the Gwangju area, the judges and the prosecutors have created all these problems, implying at least, and I'm making that argument outright. Basically what's happening is this is old-time Korean-style connection problem. The judge, a lot of people are suspecting, the judge himself has been there for a long time as a local-based judge. And he has built extensive, allegedly, network with the local people. And Teju Group was the leading local firm in Gwangju area, even owning a leading local newspaper company there. And so they're saying, so judge must have had a connection with these folks. And then even prosecutors are being suspected of having these connections. And they were just making a deal based on what they were thinking was fair under the law.
Well, fair, I don't know what the definition of fair for them is, but, yesterday the public prosecutor's office, in fact, said that they would do something about this case, and I think the National Tax Service has joined in on that.
Right.
But at this point, the judicial process is closed now. What can they do?
Right, very briefly on that one, they cannot really do about the ruling itself. So what the prosecutors are doing is they are trying to find new crime committed by him, meaning that hiding his assets, for instance, in order to avoid paying taxes and paying the fine, and also transferring his wealth overseas illegally. And there are big business going on under his son's name in New Zealand. So that's what they're pinning on at this point.
So how should we put this whole controversy into context? I mean, what does this mean for the rest of us?
Basically, this is a case that we are seeing being created by the people who are very anachronistic in a way in terms of their thinking. Having these thoughts that's like several decades old here in Korea. And they were probably saying, well, it's not harming anyone anyway, so let's find a justifiable case within what the law prohibits and then what doesn't say we cannot do. And this is the deal that they came up with. But the thing is, this day and age of SNS and openness and then freedom of press that we have in this Korea, in this country, I think the case went over and beyond the limits that they had imagined. So in a way, I think this is a good sign. The country is making a progress in terms of openness and fairness here, and they should have known that a long time ago. One thing that I want to point out, however, though, for the future, to prevent this kind of cases, we want to have real names emerging. I only saw the real name of the chief prosecutor for this case only in passing in one report so far. And the head of the court panel, the judge, chief judge who made this ruling, I only saw his name only once in passing in the report. We got to have real names being printed, and in terms of finding out who makes this kind of mistakes in the future. And if we have such a system, I'm sure we will further reduce this kind of old thinking-based mishaps.
Definitely, with the administration putting emphasis on transparency in the society, right. And exposing the real names would definitely hold the judges and the prosecutors accountable. So let's hope that that change will be made.
Let's hope so.
All right, Dr. Kim Byoungjoo, thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
And on that note, we'll have to close this newscast for now. Thank you for watching, but do join me again at 6 p.m. Korea time on Early Edition at 6.